Thank you for joining us. And now, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to embarrass my intern, Carly Hicks from Anderson County. She's been with me for a few weeks now. She's doing a great job. So
Excellent.
welcome.
Thanks, Carly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I saw Carly on the floor yesterday, so she was paying very close attention to all the stuff going on. Welcome to Federal and State Affairs. Are there bill introductions? Brett Glendenning, come on up. Oh,
sorry, is that better?
Restate, yeah,
I'll
your
restate
name and
that.
everything. So,
thank you, Chairman Thompson. Brett Glendenning, City Manager for the City of Osawatomie. The city would like to request the introduction of 25 RS 0354 legislation concerning state-owned property near and within the City of Osawatomie. Thank you.
committee, any questions or objections to the introduction of the bill? Seeing none, that's introduced. Thank you, Brett. Any other bill introductions? Senator Blue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 25 RS 0171, and it is a bill concerning childcare.
Very good. Any questions or objections to the introduction of that bill? Seeing none, that's introduced. Any other bill introductions? I do have a few here. I've got 25 RS 0821, and that is for Convention of States Article 5 term limits. Any questions or objections to introduction of that bill? Seeing none, that's introduced. Next is 25 RS 0296. It has to do with industrial scale solar and wind leases. Any questions or objections to the introduction of that? Seeing none, that is introduced. Are you keeping up, Jason? Writing fast. Next is 25 RS 0323. Has to do with decommissioning of industrial scale wind and solar projects. Any questions or objections on that? Seeing none, that's introduced. And finally, 25 RS 0460. That has to do with a smoking ban in casinos. And any question or objection to introduction there? Seeing none. Oh, Senator Faust-Godot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry for my tardiness. My other committee ran over. So smoking bans in casinos, exactly. What do you mean? I mean,
oh, that is
all of them?
The bill requester, yeah, the casinos in Kansas. That's what this particular bill, if introduced and heard, would do. So we'll, obviously it has to go through the whole process.
Mr. Chairman, Jason, so does that affect the Native American, those? Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I believe this bill, the current law, there is an exemption from the statewide smoking ban for the floors of these state-owned casinos, and my understanding is this legislation would remove that exemption.
Okay. Any other questions? Seeing none, that is introduced. Any other bill introductions? Seeing none, we'll move on to our first order of business, which is final action on the confirmation and appointment of Colonel Carlin Williams to the rank of Brigadier General. Just as a reminder, there are three different motions that can be made. Favorably recommend for the approval of the confirmation, approval confirmation for without recommendation, or recommend disapproval for the confirmation. Those are the three motions that we have, and thought I'd review that since we don't typically make those motions here. Any discussion on the confirmation hearing that we had yesterday? Are there any motions? Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Colonel Carlin Williams be allowed to be at the rank of Brigadier General. Is that the way I phrase it?
Yeah, we could say favorably recommend the approval of confirmation of Colonel Williams to the rank of Brigadier General.
And that is what I said. Thank you very much.
That's what I heard, Senator Goss. Is there a second on that? A second by Senator Dietrich, I think. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. It sounds unanimous to me. The recommendation heading to the floor for confirmation. So congratulations to Colonel Williams. Next, excellent. Next, we're going to have a hearing on Senate Bill 38, which is creating the Defend the Guard Act to establish when the Kansas National Guard may be released into active duty. And to have a bill brief, we'll have Jason Long, our reviser, give us an overview of the bill. Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Senate Bill 38 would enact the Defend the Guard Act. This would be a new statute that would prohibit the release of the Kansas National Guard or any member of the Guard for active duty combat unless the United States Congress has declared war or taken official action under its constitutional powers to call on the Guard to execute the laws of the United States, to repel an invasion, or to suppress an insurrection. And so barring one of those conditions occurring, the National Guard could not be deployed for active duty combat by the governor under the provisions of the proposed act. It does not limit or prohibit members of the Guard from being released for defense support for civil authority missions within the United States, such as federal responses to national disasters. If you are interested, the bill does define active duty combat on page 1 in line 33 as performing the following services in the active federal military service of the United States. And you can see there participation in an armed conflict, performance of a hazardous service relating to an armed conflict in a foreign state, or performance of a duty through an instrumentality of war. And so that's the definition we're looking at. There's also a definition on page 2 of an official declaration of war, since that is one of the specified conditions for releasing Guard members into active duty combat. This would go into effect on July 1st of this year if enacted. I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Jason. Committee, any questions? Senator Faust-Godot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jason, so what's the current process without this bill?
Currently, I believe the governor has some discretion as to the deployment of the Kansas National Guard. Of course, that's in conjunction with the authority of the Adjutant General, who heads up the Guard in the state of Kansas. I can definitely look into more specifics on that if you'd like to. This bill is more of a limiting nature in terms of when members cannot be deployed.
Mr. Chairman, if I may real quick, how would this contradict the legislation that we are wanting our National Guard to go protect the borders, if any, or does it affect that at all? Thank you.
I am not aware of any specific active legislation. I've seen resolutions encouraging the governor to deploy the National Guard for those purposes. I've not seen legislation requiring the deployment of the Guard in those situations, so I can't say that there would necessarily be a conflict. Although if this bill were enacted, then any deployment of the governor in those situations might be called into question. We'll see. I honestly, I'm not sure if those would be considered active duty combat situations as it's defined in this bill, so that probably would be allowed under the provisions of Senate Bill 38, but I'd have to do a little bit more research and look at some of those proposals that have come through the legislature.
Senator Blue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To follow up on the previous senator's question, I have the same one dealing with the veto override that we did last year for the $15 million to go to the border to help out Texas. So that's where I'm curious if you could look into if this would be enacted, could we not have done that?
Well, Senate Bill 38 doesn't apply to any use of monies by the state for use by Kansas Guard members. It really just speaks to deployment of Guard members into active duty combat situations as defined under the bill. So in terms of an appropriation of monies, that clearly doesn't look like it would be impacted under Senate Bill 38. It's just the actual deployment of Guard members into active duty combat situations.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, committee? Senator Clifford.
Chairman, just to follow up to what you just said, if we don't agree to deploy when we're activated federally, we lose the money. Is that not correct?
I'm not entirely sure what the strings are with that federal funding. Yes, it could be that if we do not deploy when called up by the federal military service, then there could be some withholding of federal funds. I would have to look into that in more depth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And there is a fiscal note on this that, that discusses that, and we can probably ask questions to clarify more on that situation. Any other questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you, Jason. We will open proponent testimony then. We have 4 people by WebEx. Again, we'll do block timing on this. I think what I'll do, so we have time for questions, is do our typical 10 minutes. So again, all of you who are testifying either for or against, just be aware I'm not going to limit any one speaker, but when the 10-minute time period is up, that side is done, and then we turn to questions, then the next side. So self-regulate on your timing, but that's the way we do it in here. So first up, we have Dan McKnight with Bring Our Troops Home, and Dan is on WebEx. Can you hear us, Dan?
I can hear you. Can you hear me okay, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, we're in good shape. Go ahead, sir.
Excellent. Well, Chairman and members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to tell your support of SB 38 to defend the Guard.
Dan, you're breaking up for some reason. I think your signal. Yeah, I think your signal is not very good. We weren't.
Okay.
We were getting about every other word. Yeah, maybe you're.
Okay. How about now? Can you hear me? Okay?
That's much better. Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll do it without the video then. Perfect. Okay. To answer some of the questions that have already been asked, this bill only is in relation to combat deployments overseas outside of the continental United States. So at its core, SB 38 restores the constitutional law and closes loopholes that have led to the misuse of the National Guard. It ensures that our guardsmen cannot be deployed overseas at the discretion of a single individual or an unelected bureaucrat, but only when duty, law, and a formal congressional declaration require it. It wouldn't stop the Guard from going down to the border and defending against an invasion or supporting federal law enforcement. See, the president already has limited authority to federalize the Guard, and the Constitution allows for the National Guard to be called forth to repel an invasion, to suppress an insurrection, and to enforce the laws of the Union. In addition to that, federal law also says that the president can call forward the National Guard with congressional approval. In Title 10 USC Section 12301, they have to have congressional approval. In 12302, the president can call up the Guard without congressional approval on a very limited basis. Additionally, the governor already has the ability to stop deployments at his discretion without a proper congressional declaration, but there's a loophole in Title 10 that's allowed the president to take the National Guard into foreign wars ever since 1942. And that's what Senate Bill 38 does, is to plug that loophole. So let's talk real quick about what it does, and then I'll pass the microphone to the next testifier. SB 38, it does not interfere with disaster response training, emergency missions, or anything else. It doesn't limit South Dakota's ability to uphold national security. It does not prevent the Guard from responding to an invasion, an insurrection, or enforcing federal laws. And it ensures that the South Dakota Guardsmen are the Kansas Guardsmen are only sent to war when Congress follows the law. So I urge you to pass this bill. It's constitutional. It's not radical. It simply realigns Kansas with the principles of the Constitution that are enshrined by our founding fathers in their original intent. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'll stand for any questions.
Thank you, Dan. We'll hold for questions till the end of the 10-minute block. Up next is Darren Gobb. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Lieutenant Colonel, retired, and State Freedom Caucus Network. Darren, are you with us? Darren, hello? Are you on WebEx? He's not. Darren is not. Okay. We'll move on then to Scott Horton, private citizen. Scott, are you on WebEx?
Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we're in good shape. Go ahead, Scott.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me here. Big changes are going on in the country today, as everyone knows. MAGA, Make America Great Again, includes America First. And America First is not just a Trump movement, it's really a reorientation of the entire American right toward patriotism and against globalism and interventionism. And America First doesn't mean selfishness and belligerence. It means defend America first, take care of the American people first, and stop trying to be the policeman of the world and the empire that controls the Middle East, Europe, and East Asia and can barely control all of the chaos in our own country. Trump is obviously, even in his first weeks here, making major changes, spending all foreign aid and threatening to shake up America's posture around the world. And we know from his last time in office that the government will be against that. He's just the White House. He's got an entire executive branch to rule all the national security establishment and the military to try to get control of. And he's going to need our support out here in the country. It has to be an inescapable fact for all the TV news ladies and everyone that there is a real movement among Republicans in this country to end the wars, to come home, let's have 4 years in a row of no wars at all. Let's start with that and try that. And he clearly ran on that. And that's clearly how he won the election. It's a big part of why a lot of Democrats crossed the aisle to support him. But here, he needs a movement in the country to show that he's right, that this really is what the American people want. And in fact, he has this movement that's already been going on, represented by the great Dan McKnight and the other veterans from bringourtroopshome.us and defendtheguard.us. They're the ones who are spearheading this. And they're all veterans of the Iraq and Afghan wars, of these recent wars of our generation that we all regret now that we never should have done if we'd listened to guys like them in the first place. And so that's what's really going on here. So the president needs our support. Here's a giant parade for him to get in front of. And in fact, I'll go ahead and mention that Pete Hegseth, the new confirmed Secretary of Defense, reiterated to Dan McKnight the other day that he supports the Defend the Guard movement. So yesterday in South Dakota, they had a general there to oppose this legislation. I'm not sure if there's a general there in your hearing room there to oppose this legislation today, but he might want to call the Office of Secretary of Defense and check in and make sure whether he's out of line or not, because the new Secretary of Defense supports this legislation. As it is, you might take it as an extreme measure. You don't know maybe whether you want to go this far, but that is the point. But what are these veterans asking you to do? They're asking you to demand that the president obey the Constitution. Of course, he can have his reserve guard forces if he needs them. And if he needs them, then he can go to the Congress and get a declaration of war. That's the law. It's the same one they took their oath to, same one you guys took your oath to, same one the president and all the congressmen took their oath to. We all know it. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, right? Only Congress can declare war. And Dan McKnight, who fought in Afghanistan, is the one leading this thing, and he's a Republican and a patriot, and is saying and is showing really the country that this is the way to do it. This is the constitutional mechanism to do it. You will hear from opponents today probably about the supremacy clause. Well, the supremacy clause says that whatever the national government says goes, and the states have to always give in 100%. But that's not what it says. That's only when they're obeying the Constitution and enforcing the constitutional law. And that is what is in question here. And this is exactly what James Madison, the primary author of the Constitution, intended with nullification and interposition. This legislation simply insists that the governor assert his own power over the National Guard and keep these men from being forced into combat roles overseas without an official declaration of war. And you may also hear from opponents today that this will restrict the National Guard in all these other ways, but that's not true. As the proponents have already explained, and as the text explains, this only prevents Say, for example, President Michelle Obama from declaring war against Libya again while on vacation in Brazil, like her husband did, and possibly getting American troops involved in another no-win mission where we don't belong over there, that everyone would regret later. And so this is
Minutes
precisely the
left,
constitutional
Scott.
remedy, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Finally, we have Sean Held, private citizen. Sean, you've got about 2 minutes left if you're online.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
Okay, I'll try to go fast. This bill puts reasonable checks on federal overreach. The Constitution clearly states our wars are to be declared by Congress. This is further emphasized by the discussions in the Constitutional Convention and in the Federalist Papers. I'd like to give a little background on how we got here. In every conflict since World War II, this power has been usurped by the executive. Truman just unilaterally sent troops into Korea and West Germany during that war, claiming that the UN's call for military action authorized him to do so. He didn't seek congressional approval in advance or in retrospect. 1945 assurances to Congress that their approval be sought for UN operations were forgotten. Congress declined to defend their constitutional authority. They funded it both directly and indirectly. In this police action under the UN, as Truman called it, 2.5 million people were killed, 36,000 of them Americans. They made the precedent into law in 1973 with the War Powers Act, allowing president to initiate a conflict for up to 60 days before they either end it or Congress authorizes the continuation. Doesn't matter what you call it, a police action, peacekeeping mission, fighting terrorism, it puts the war power in the hands of one man, then puts Congress into the position of either supporting the troops or not paying them. Support shouldn't involve just flippantly risking people's lives in subversion of the Constitution, but they've done it so many times. I have a short article linked at the bottom of my written testimony. I invite you to read for a more expansive take on this. Over the years, I've worked with many of these brave citizen soldiers. I've witnessed a small part of the mental, emotional, and physical toll that these illegal and undeclared wars take on them. Over 650,000 guardsmen were deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, making up 45% of the total force and suffering 18.4% of the casualties. They also saw combat Syria and Somalia. Constitutional analog of the Guard is the militia. It's always intended a volunteer force, primary duties to the state. Federal government can only call them forth time of insurrection or invasion. Doesn't matter. When they're used to support the federal army overseas, they're unavailable to serve their home states, whether that's for disaster relief, civil unrest, border security, or defense of the homeland. Today, you're going to hear doom and gloom predictions of how the bill will result in D.C. pulling funding and equipment. Some people don't want our wars to be debated in Congress. I'm more concerned with the lives of our guardsmen and the legality of our wars than with money. The fact that they respond with threats to the mere suggestion of the constitutional declaration of war says quite a bit about their motives and the
Sean, we're out of time, unfortunately.
Almighty God, support and defend. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sean. We appreciate that. 10 minutes up. We have committee proponent written testimony from 8 different people. That's in your S drive. I'm going to open it up for questions for the proponents from the committee. For any of our folks on WebEx. I know Darren, I don't think was there yet, but Dan or Scott or Sean, any questions? Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Please forgive me, but I'm a bit confused in that the way I read this and understood from when Jason was explaining the bill is that it would prohibit the National Guard or any member of the Guard for active duty unless the U.S. Congress declares war or takes official action under its enumerated constitutional powers. But it appears to me, maybe this question's more for Jason, it appears to me that that would already happen. I mean, could the governor, at her discretion, there's no war been declared, she can't just, or he, whoever the governor is, can't just send somebody overseas or to be involved in a war. I guess I'm sorry, I'm trying to understand what it does that it doesn't already do. And I realize Senator Faustido asked that earlier, but I still am confused.
Jason, if you'd like to elaborate on that, and we'll probably ask that question of our proponents as well.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, it's my understanding that The bill would limit the governor from deploying Guard members except in those limited situations for active duty combat, including situations in which the Guard may have been called up by the federal military service for active duty combat, but without a declaration of war or other official action from Congress. And so with this statute in place, as my understanding, the Guard would not be released in those situations unless Congress took one of the specified actions under the bill. And I believe that is what the proponents have been alluding to, is actions in which active duty combat situations have arisen and Guard members have been called up, but without an official declaration of war or other official action by Congress. But I would defer to the proponents or even the other conferees to clarify the issue.
Yeah.
One more question, Jason, and that is so that the mention was if they were to go down to the border, or which is not foreign lands, if we know of like a horrible tornado in Kansas where the National Guard was called up to go down and help with that. We're not talking about any of that, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure, and if one of our three oral proponents would like to weigh in on that briefly.
I'd be happy to.
Who is this?
This is Dan McKnight from Bring Our Troops Home.
Okay, Dan, go ahead.
Yep, thank you for the opportunity to further explain this. So currently, the president can call forth the militia under very clear and enumerated ways and purposes. And again, he has to have congressional authority for a full mobilization, or he can do it on his own discretion for a partial mobilization. The president, during Reagan's tenure, he sent the National Guard down to Central America for a training mission where they were building roads and runways in Honduras. And governors of several states thought that President Reagan was preparing to invade Central America, and they opposed their National Guard going overseas at the president's desires. And so they sued the Department of Defense, and the Supreme Court ultimately came back and said, you know what, the president absolutely can send the National Guard overseas for the purposes of training, and the governors cannot object. And since that time, they were very clear that it was for training purposes only. Since that time, the National Guard has been sent out of the country to participate in combat operations, peacekeeping, policing missions, anything that they can think of other than training, and use that ruling as the justification for it. And so that's what this bill is designed to do, is to close that loophole. The Supreme Court was clear in the Perpich decision that the president has the authority to send the National Guard outside the country for specific purposes. Undeclared war is not one of them. And that's the purpose of this bill, is to close that loophole and put the authority back in the governor's hands to interpose between an overreaching executive at the federal level and their own state National Guard.
Thank you, Dan. Any other questions, committee? Senator Francisco, sorry. Starts with F. It's early. Thank you, Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So reading ahead in some of the opponent's testimony, I understand there is an understanding of dual enlistment, that you'd be enlisted both in the National Guard, in the Kansas National Guard, and also the overall National Guard, and that there was another Supreme Court ruling that came out of Camp Funston, Kansas in 1918 that might address this. Would any of the proponents want to address that question of is there dual enlistment or that other court ruling?
Good question. Any Dan or Scott or Sean, either one want to weigh in?
I'd be happy to take it again if Sean, unless Sean wants this. But this is Dan from Bring Our Troops Home.
By all means, go ahead.
Sure.
Okay,
yep, absolutely. Yep. When National Guardsmen and women, yes, go ahead.
Dan McKnight, just want to make sure that's who's answering. Yes, Dan.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, it's a great question. When Kansas citizens enlist in the National Guard, they swear an oath to the United States Constitution, and they are dual enlisted in the Kansas National Guard and the National Guard of the United States of America. They remain under the governor's control until such a time that they're called forward by the president or Congress following Title 10 of U.S. Code or Title 32 of U.S. Code. When they're called forward under Title 32, they are under federal pay and benefits, but the governor's control. So that would be for like tornado help, like you mentioned earlier, or fires or national emergencies or the COVID response. Or if they're called forward by Congress and the president under Title 10, they're on a federal mission that's federally funded, and the president becomes the commander in chief of those troops. They convert to the National Guard of the United States, and they're no longer Kansas National Guard. Those authorities to call them forward under Title 10 is what this bill is trying to address. The loophole in Section 12301 and 122 of Title 10 is the problem here, and that's what this bill is designed to do, is to limit, not even limit, to clarify when the president can call forward the Kansas National Guard and bring them under federal control, under his power or her power as the commander-in-chief. So the dual enlistment is true. They serve a very unique role. It's not found in any other branch of the military other than the National Guard and the Air National Guard. They are part of the total force structure of the United States Department of Defense. They serve a critical role both locally, federally, and on the world stage. If America does need to go to war, we should call in the National Guard to go fight and win. And they should be able to do it with the clear authority and the informed consent of the American people. And that's all this bill does, is ask that Congress do their job and declare war. And then every zip code in America then becomes invested in the war properly.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Dan, and everyone on the proponent side. Next, we'll move on to our opponent testimony, and we've got 3 in-person folks providing testimony. And again, we'll do a 10-minute block. Start off with Lieutenant Colonel Jacob McElwee, legal advisor to the Adjutant General. Colonel McElwee, welcome to Federal and State Affairs, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the opportunity to address this bill and to explain why, from the Kansas National Guard's perspective, we oppose it and why it's not in the Kansas National Guard's best interest or in Kansas's best interest. As a way of introduction, my name is Jacob McElwee, and I'm a member of the Kansas National Guard. And Senator, as you alluded to in your question, I'm not just a member of the Kansas National Guard. I'm also a member of the National Guard of the United States. And as such, I wear multiple hats throughout the course of my life. Sometimes I'm a citizen, sometimes I'm a member of the Kansas National Guard, and sometimes a member of the National Guard of the United States. And here's the practical implication of that and why that distinction thwarts the entire emphasis of this bill. When President Trump last mobilized me on Title 10 orders in 2018, I ceased my membership in the Kansas National Guard, and I went on to serve in the National Guard of the United States. And so when I was in the Middle East 7 years ago, I was a Title 10 soldier. And so my ability to move in between statuses is kind of what defines the unique nature of the Kansas National Guard and the National Guard itself. Now, when our friends who were the proponents of this testimony were making arguments along the lines of, you know, it's not constitutional to mobilize me without a declaration of war, there's just 200 years of jurisprudence that suggests that that's simply not true. So if you want to go back to the early 1800s, it was established very early on that we could send troops places without a formal declaration of war. This isn't a new concept in the United States. If you want to talk about whether or not I can be mobilized without the governor's consent, that simply comes down to the Supremacy Clause. And when our friends who are proposing this testimony talked about Perpich in 1990, what the Supreme Court decided there was that the federal government has supremacy over the state in matters of the military. And the Militia Clause, in fact, does not constrain Congress's ability to raise a standing army. It simply supplants it, and it helps it. So by itself, outside of the Militia Clause, Congress already has the power to raise an army. And so when I got called in 2018 to deploy to the Middle East, I simply became another member of a Title 10 soldier. And so I hope that that explains the overall mechanics of how that works. I belong to 3 things. I am a proud citizen of Kansas. I'm a proud member of the Kansas National Guard, and I'm a proud member of the National Guard of the United States. And so, but when President Trump wants to mobilize me, I go without anybody's say. Once President Trump says, you know, Jacob, you're a Title 10 soldier, I'm a Title 10 soldier. And that is based off of the Supremacy Clause, that's based off of 200 years of jurisprudence, and that's based off of, you know, just the general idea that I don't just belong to the Kansas National Guard. So hopefully that gives you a broader context, but let's stop talking about law real quick, and let's start talking about the real practical implications of what this bill will mean for Kansas. I would direct you all to 32 U.S.C. 108 that says the federal government has the power to stop funding the Kansas National Guard if we cannot complete our federal mission. This isn't doom and gloom. This isn't me making stuff up. This is in 32 U.S.C. 108 that says if we don't complete our federal mission, the federal government can withhold funds. And it's fairly axiomatic, right? They're paying for our federal mission. They're not paying for our state mission. And if we're not doing the federal mission, why would they pay? Why would they pay? So here's how and here's why it impacts Kansas. I would encourage all of you to look at the Kansas response plan and go 5 pages without seeing where the National Guard plays a clear and decisive role in responding to cyber attacks, chemical attacks, natural disasters. We provide over 6,000 people that can be boots on ground almost immediately and also under the control of you and the governor. And if you take that away from Kansas, where are we filling in that gap when we have the next Greensburg, when we have the next giant cyber attack, if we have a giant pandemic? Where are we coming up with that, if not for the Kansas National Guard? If you look at our fiscal note, right now, we get approximately $270 million from the federal government and about $9.5 million from the state. So effectively, what's at stake here is our ability to respond to Kansas disasters, our ability to be a strong and competent reactive force to problems Kansans see every day. And so, you know, while, you know, my heart lies primarily in Kansas, I also go where President Trump tells me to go. But our federal funding is completely contingent on that. So I'm going to stop talking now because I'll talk forever if you let me. But but otherwise, I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Colonel. Up next, we have, and we'll hold for questions till the 10-minute block, Keith Marshall, Lieutenant Colonel, and he's with the Adjutant General's Department.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Just to continue my colleague's testimony, so I'm the legislative liaison for the Kansas Adjutant General's Department and Kansas National Guard. Our boss, Major General Vernerde, would have liked to have been here, but he is overseas right now, so he was unfortunately able to attend. Like my colleague said, $270 million roundabout is at risk for us every year in this bill. And you know, they said that there's a lot of doom and gloom there because it is a drastic situation for us that we're facing, losing that money. And there's precedent set that when the federal government cannot access the National Guard for missions, that they will remove the funding, equipment, and missions from that National Guard and move it somewhere else where they can access it. That precedent is actually relatively recent. It was passed in December, so just last month, with the 2025 National Defense Authorization Act. And what that addressed was when the Space Force was created, it left several units behind in the Air National Guard that were performing Space Force missions. So the Department of Defense didn't have a clear way to access from one military service to a National Guard and another military service. So the route that they chose was the Department of Defense went to Congress and requested to just take those missions away from the Air National Guard and assign them to the Active Duty Space Force. And Congress authorized that in the 2025 NDAA. So for the first time, we will see those, the missions, the units, and the funding transferred out of National Guard units and to active duty where the active duty is able to access them. And so Alaska, California, Colorado, Florida, Hawaii, New York, and Ohio will all lose National Guard forces as those are absorbed into active duty. And that it's not the exact same problem that we have, but it's the same root cause of access to the National Guard. So we do stand at risk of losing that funding in those missions, Mr. Chairman, if this bill were to pass. So what I heard from some of the previous conferees is concerns with two federal statutes, Title 10 U.S. Code 12301 and 12302. The way to address problems with U.S. Code is through U.S. Congress. and not through states putting the state's National Guards at risk and putting your National Guard at risk of being able to perform the missions that my colleague talked about. So I would just urge you to allow these outside groups to address this at the federal level where the problem that they see is rooted, and not put the Kansas National Guard at risk through doing that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will stand for questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel. Up next, our final in-person is Michael Kelly, Colonel, retired from the U.S. Air Force.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to talk about something darker. Think about the worst war you can think of. That would be a nuclear war. And President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev in 1985 issued a statement, nuclear war must never be won, or cannot ever be won, and must never be fought. The way we do that is through our strategy of nuclear deterrence. We have ready forces to respond if someone attacks us with nuclear weapons. And because our response capabilities are strong, no one does that. There's a Chinese philosopher named Sun Tzu. He's one of the big three in military strategy. He lived 2,500 years ago. He said the best practice of war is when you convince the enemy not to fight one. So that's what nuclear deterrence is about. The Kansas National Guard today, just a few miles from where we are, is part of our nuclear deterrence strategy. It's about 40 minutes of flight time from Asia to the central United States for an intercontinental ballistic missile. Congress isn't going to...
You got about 30 seconds, I saw.
Congress isn't going to be able to declare war within 40 minutes. Kansas National Guard has a key role. We'd lose that role if Senate Bill 38 becomes law. Mr. Chairman, I stand ready for any further questions.
Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate that. Committee, we also have one opponent written testimony from Nikki Inskeep from National Guard Association. So I'm going to open it up to questions now from the committee for any of our opponents. And any questions? Yeah, Senator Murphy.
Yes, for Colonel Kelly. Just, this addresses, sending troops into combat. So the nuclear situation you indicated wouldn't have any effect on that, would it?
It absolutely would have an effect, sir. And sir, when I was a much younger man, I served on a Strategic Air Command combat crew. Now, I was based in Tucson, Arizona, but I was one of the 4 members of a missile crew that was targeted against our adversaries. And the only way I could get orders to launch from the president is if communication systems were intact. And the way communication systems remain intact, even when under nuclear attack, is we have multiple redundant methods of communication. And what the Kansas National Guard did then, and I guess continue to do, is they support one of the redundant means of communication between the president and our nuclear forces. And that absolutely is combat. And whether that airplane is flying over the 48 continental United States or off the coast in either Atlantic or Pacific, it's immaterial. It's combat.
I recognize I was raised in SAC.
Yes, sir.
I'm well aware.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Any other questions? I do have one for either one of the colonels there, and with regard to just helping me understand the federal funds that are at stake. Just so I'm clear on this, since you have the, you Kansas National Guard, U.S. National Guard, is training, what you do in the state and all the various things you do within the state, is that not considered a federal mission, keeping your force trained and ready? I'm just curious whether you will absolutely lose those funds or if those funds are at jeopardy.
I think a fair characterization is that they're in a large degree of jeopardy. And my reasoning for this is fairly simple. One, like I said or previously, you know, our fiscal note says $270 million comes from the federal government. That federal government is for federal missions. They allow us to work within the confines of the state and help the state out because that helps us stay prepared when we go do warfighting missions. And so that helps, and so it's just fairly axiomatic in the sense of why would they pay for something if they're not going to get it? And then the second reason why I say that it's at risk is because at heart, what this would do, what this legislation would do is the federal government could claim the supremacy clause and we could litigate this out and Governor Kelly or a soldier could bring a lawsuit and we could essentially relitigate Pepperidge and from 1990 when the Supreme Court said, no, the Montgomery Act says the president has supremacy over the military or the federal government has supremacy over the military. They can federalize them. So we could relitigate that, right? But from a DOD perspective, I think what would happen is they would say, well, I have these 5 units. One of them has to deploy in 18 months. I don't want the headache of having to deal with lawsuits and injunctions and maybe 6 weeks before they're supposed to go out the door, I get an injunction from someone in the 10th Circuit saying I can't send them, then I'm scrambling to try to find another 800 boots on the ground. And what they do is they just move them to Oklahoma, or they'd move them to Nebraska. Missouri would take the 35th ID. McConnell would be absorbed by the active duty because it just avoids a problem. It's just way easier than when you're trying to plan military operations, entering in the uncertainty of injunctions, and maybe I can't have these people here when I need them, and then I'm scrambling trying to find folks. It's just easier to move them to places where that problem doesn't exist. So I think the most likely outcome is that the funding would go because they would move personnel outside of the state, and then the Kansas National Guard would be diminished. That's probably the, Chairman, that's the most likely outcome. And I'm guessing for certain there is some conjecture there, but it just makes sense from a planning perspective.
Is there someone I could personally talk to up at the Defense Department, so I can get their perspective on that?
We'd be happy to provide people that you can talk to, and obviously I don't have those names and contact information.
No, not right now. I understand.
We would be happy to provide that. But again, I think for the entire committee, I think the best starting point is 32 USC 108, where they've already put into statute, they've already peeked around the corner and have anticipated this, right? So like the groundwork is there. This wouldn't be some giant act. They would just have some lawyer point at the law and say, well, what's our justification for moving people and pulling funding? And it would be like, well, it's right here in federal law, sir. And that would be that.
If you do have some contacts that any of the committee would like to discuss, to clarify, send them to Angela, my committee assistant. She'll distribute those contacts to the committee so they can ask those questions too. I mean, because we want to clarify that those funds, if this bill were to move forward, would not be in jeopardy, what the disposition of the Defense Department would be, and go from there. Because with the changing of the guard at the top, with Mr. Hegseth as a new secretary, who knows what changes there might be.
And as our friends pointed out earlier, you know, that Mr. Hegseth is, you know, they had conversations and they said he's in support of don't defend the guard. Well, if that's the case, then there's really no reason to pass this bill because he won't try to mobilize us. And then we'll still get our federal funding, and you're not incurring any risk for the state of Kansas because he wouldn't want to mobilize us absent a declaration of war. So even if we take our friends' testimony seriously, which I would encourage you to do, I mean, you know, this has been tension within the United States for a long time. There's no reason to pass this bill because he's not going to mobilize us absent a declaration. So why even take the risk? That would be my answer to that too, sir.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Colonel. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Committee, that is all. We will close the hearing on Senate Bill 38. We don't have a meeting tomorrow, and then I think, check your agenda for Monday. I think we have a little bill hearing. Monday, I'm not sure. I can't remember which bill number we've got on the agenda, but we'll probably have a bill hearing on Monday. So thank you for your work today, and we are adjourned. 4, it's a Senate concurrent resolution. Okay.